Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It's another live stream on this Friday, the 18th of August, coming to you at 10 of the clock, or 2200 hours from Perfidious Albion. And I'm going to be going through tonight some details with regard to the revolutionary events that are taking place on the continent of Africa right now, and looking at some events further afield, but mainly focusing on Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and the ECOWAS and African Union divisions, and the potential for some kind of US or French attempt at a military intervention, possible or impossible, though it may be, and answering any questions that come up therein. Now, just before we get underway properly, I'm going to look at just making a couple of structural announcements, shall we say. So coming up over the next few days, we've got a stream tomorrow at probably going to be 10 again, and that's going to be on the Mao text from the 1950s on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. So that's going to be our reading group episode. So be sure to come along and take a look at that. So that's going to be on Saturday. On Sunday from 11 till 1, so that's 11 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon, we're going to have the weekly Q&A. And I already had some great questions come in for that one, including on the nature or an inevitability of deindustrialization or otherwise. What should we do with the left? And thank you to my comrade Jason for that one. The answer could be very short with regard to that particular question. And the other questions on rates of profit in the imperialist extraction of profit from the third world. So good few questions already to get us underway with. If you have questions, you can note them in the chat tonight or leave them on the Patreon page, and I'll get to them on Sunday. And of course, on Monday of next week, we are going to be having the film review I know that you have all been waiting for, which is the anti-CIA film from Steven Seagal from 1987, Above the Law, one of Steven Seagal's finest works. And we're going to be discussing that and having a broader discussion of the brief CIA as villains genre that existed in American filmmaking probably between the mid-1970s, but especially in the 80s. So, yeah, stay tuned for that one. And then what we're going to be doing from then on is, I think, I'm going to start dividing the days up to cover certain areas of the world. So I think Ukraine and all related issues are going to be our regular Tuesday slot from now on. And I think we're going to be using Friday, i.e. this day, from now on to cover the unfolding events in Niger and related questions with regard to the African Revolution, which is, I think it's legitimate to say that an African revolution is beginning or has already begun in West Africa and could really take off and fundamentally transform many areas of that particular continent very, very quickly. So it's worthy of a live stream per week looking at it. So other shows to be announced in terms of stuff coming up purely on Patreon. This weekend I'm recording the edition on the August coup that saw the the beginning of the final collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And so going to be talking about that with the perspective of, well, whose coup actually was it? And some interesting things to say upon that. Going to be recording the Patreon's film review edition of Solaris probably on Sunday of next week, sorry. So look out for that one. And then next week, going to be looking at the first episode on what it'll be an ongoing series, or I should say the second episode, really, of the history of the Eastern Bloc. I started doing this and then came back to it. So going to be doing an audio version of that first for patrons, and that's going to be the first episode of that's going to be next week on the Second World War in Romania and the establishment of the socialist state or the people's democracy coming out of that under the leadership of Gheorghe Dej and what that meant. And I've managed to get hold of an e-copy of a fascinating book by the old Communist Party of Great Britain writer Maurice Cornforth, who wrote a really good study of the first decade of socialism in Romania. So that's going to be my principal source for that. So all of that's coming up. And now we'll pause just to say hello to everybody in the chat. Hello to Jason. Hello to Zuleika. Hello to President Jesus and everybody else who's there. And to answer Zuleika's question, if you want the Barbie review, Slavoj Zizek has done one. I'm sure it's great. And every other podcast has done one, usually winking and, at the irony of the whole thing. I will not be doing any of that because, I'm not Zizek. Long may that be the case. So the first question under discussion tonight with regard to the African Revolution, because there's several parts into which we have to divide this, is the update on where things have got to in Niger itself. Now, the junta which came to power, which appears to have a very positive level of support, at least 70% according to polls that have been conducted so far. I think these polls are mainly in the taking place in the capital Niamey. The polls show that the government, the military government, has a support level of at least 70 to 75%. So that's worthy of note, as is the fact that there are forming, with according to reports from the capital and the other major urban centres, volunteer militias that are being formed to defend the sovereignty of the country. So in addition to the armed forces, ordinary people in Niger are volunteering to form essentially people's defence units to solidify the revolution and to mobilize the population en masse. And this is something which is taking place apparently independently of the leaders of the military government, and is seeing a mobilization of the working class and peasantry in a way that's not been done before. And I'll come back to what this means in terms of the potential for revolutionary struggle later on. But it follows on from a similar development that's taken place in Burkina Faso, where President Traoré and his, I think you can call them a Sankarist administration, have also formed people's defense units to fight against the jihadists in the country, who, objectively speaking, the jihadists are servants of imperialism. Whether the individual jihadist there knows it or not, that's what he is. And if you see that when Traoré returned from the Russia-Africa summit, he was greeted by a lot of these people's defense units marching through Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. And this was a triumphant return moment, and it's clearly something which has seen the mass mobilization of the Burkinabe population. And the fact that the Nigerian masses are following suit, this is very significant. So this is another factor in why ECOWAS and the African Union are deeply divided on what to do next. The Nigerian Senate, as I've previously said, has voted against military intervention. Bola Tinubu, the transparent comprador stooge of the US and the British, is apparently all in favour of military intervention, but his own party is split on the issue, as are, it appears, most of the Nigerian political elite, not because these people are supporting anti-colonial revolutions in Niger, but because they're worried about the effect it'll have on them. I mean, the Western media talks about, well, what will happen if Boko Haram make a push in this time? I don't think that's what they're worried about. I think they're more worried that in doing so, the domestic population might revolt, and that's far more dangerous than whatever the hell Boko Haram gets up to. The idea that the Nigerian working class might revolt against the government in Abuja is what's worrying the political leadership in Nigeria. However, Tinubu will be under intense pressure, particularly from the French. I'm not sure exactly what line the British are taking. But if you can imagine the slipperiest, most treacherous and bloodthirsty possible, that's usually what the British ruling class is up to. The temptation for them to stiff the French will be large, but they'll also be worried that if what's going on in Niger catches on and the military government there it survives and solidifies itself in power, then this will add the impetus to potential revolutionary events happening elsewhere in the African continent, including, of course, in places like Kenya, where there is still a disputed election, where the British ruling class still has an extensive amount of interests, including in agriculture and in a military base that's very important to British global operations that they have there, where, of course, there's an awful lot of scandal surrounding it regarding British squaddies raping and murdering local women. Let's be just blunt and say exactly what it is. So there's a lot of ground for the British to lose as well, even though this first event, or this latest event, is most directly attacking French imperial interests. There's a lot of British interests in the African continent as well that could be endangered if this wave starts to spread. And you can see the way that the masses in Niger have embraced this military government that's emerged from the latest coup, because, again, they understand who is responsible for the miseries that have been inflicted on them over the years. And I want to go through a little bit about exactly what has gone on in Niger. I mean, there's obviously the question of the many, many coups that have taken place, but I'll just drop a link to an article that's been released recently by my own party on this particular question, because I think this gives a good summary. But there has been, of course, a number of coups since nominal independence was granted in 1960. But before the independence in Niger was even granted, the French, towards the end of their colonial rule, disposed of the man who would have led Niger to independence, a guy called Djibo Bakary, who was from a group called the Mouvement Socialiste Africain, and he was a Pan-Africanist who was determined to enact socialist policies had he become leader of Niger, and wanted to actually unite all the former French colonies to start forming a Pan-African federation. So, of course, he had to go, and the French disposed of him. He was overthrown even before independence and exiled. And the socialist and Pan-Africanist movements in Niger were ruthlessly suppressed by French colonialism. And that was in the early years of independence that those movements were wiped out. A lot of people were killed. And it was brutally bludgeoned to death, basically. But the independence movement, I mean, once you have this genie out of the bottle, so to speak, once this has started, it can't be undone. Just as, to use an example I'll be returning to, the first successful socialist revolution that lasted, just as the Russian Revolution, the foundation of the Soviet Union, and all of the victories that came during the revolutionary period, all of that, the bourgeoisie, the imperialists, and the domestic reactionaries in Russia hoped that they'd extirpated, following decades of treachery, followed by the dissolution of the Union in 1991. They hoped that they'd pushed all that away. But of course, they can't unwind that history. They can't undo that history any more than the ultimate failure of the Venetian Republic could undo the foundations or the founding of capitalism, or the beginnings of capitalism, any more than the restoration of the British monarchy could undo the damage that Cromwell had done to absolutism. So the huge impact on not just in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, but globally in terms of the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, inspiring and directly informing anti-colonial movements all over the world. All of that cannot be undone. So the French might have disposed of Bokhari and his initial attempts at Pan-African socialism, but as we can see, the idea keeps returning because the masses, even though the ruling class is desperate to make these things disappear, the masses do remember. And as Mao was fond of saying, masses have a far greater degree of creativity than anybody ever gives them credit for. And the masses do remember. No matter how much propaganda is poured into their heads, they always remember because they remember, first of all, who their oppressors are, and secondly, well, what the solutions are, which is why, of course, they flocked to a new military regime that was going to, or was rhetorically at the time saying it was going to actually take on French colonialism. The masses rallied around it. And again, this is because they know very well what the actual problems facing them are and why they are facing these problems. And this is, of course, coming from, ultimately, it's French colonialism. But to return to my quote of the moment from Stalin, French colonialism, along with British colonialism, was put on rations by the Americans in 1945. And despite the protestations of de Gaulle, French colonialism managed to morph into French neocolonialism only with the at least tacit assistance of the Americans. So when you look at what's going on in formerly French West Africa, you can see that even though it's the French making a lot of the profits there, ultimately underpinning it increasingly, though, is, of course, the presence of American imperialism. So a couple of things to look at here with regard to why Niger is so poor. Remember that almost 90% of the country doesn't have electricity. There is a gigantic illiteracy rate. The average life expectancy for adult men is around 50. It's over 60% of the country is illiterate. So this is a country which is very poor, in which life is cheap, in which there is credible evidence that the French companies that run the gold mines there employ child labor en masse. And of course, one of the big earners, potential earners for any country is, of course, mineral deposits, including uranium. And of course, the French have an incredibly extensive mining operation there, which, even though it has a minority stake given to the Nigerian government, that is not something which has benefited the masses there at all. So to give a couple of bits of statistical information with regard to the uranium trade, just to give you a clearer indication of what exactly is going on here and why the country remains so poor. So the Nigerian uranium mines are currently 63% owned by something called the Orano Corporation. You can Google them and find them online. It's not immediately clear, though, as to who owns them. Well, the biggest single shareholder is, in fact, overwhelmingly dominant shareholder is the French government. They own at least 45% of the shares, and they dictate all the company's decisions. So this is a French state company. There are some minority shareholdings in it by Japanese and Australian firms as well, but the French state directs this, and the French state takes all of the profit, or the gigantic share of the profit. So according to the data that's been provided by the World Nuclear Association, the Orano Corporation is one of the top 3 producers of uranium in the world, and the most recent profit report shows that it has revenues of 4.2 billion euros a year, predicted to rise, or at least it was predicted to rise, to 4.3 billion euros this year. So this is a gigantic business, and uranium mining is enormously profitable. Furthermore, 20% of the uranium used in French nuclear reactors comes from Niger, and apparently the quality of the uranium you can dig out of the ground there is very, very high. I'm told these things vary. So not only is it providing 1/5 of the uranium used to power the plants there, it's also generating a gigantic amount of profit for what is essentially the French state. And if you look into the actual record of the Orano and its employment practices, you can see that it's a standard colonial or neo-colonial method of employing cheap labor, working them after death, and then when a uranium site is mined out, abandoning ship and leaving the place basically a radiated wasteland with miners with all kinds of radiation related ailments, because of course a lot of the time when you're digging up this stuff, the company isn't using the kind of safety procedures that you would see in a country with a strong union movement. They're just digging this up with barely any protective equipment. And of course, long-term exposure to raw uranium tends to trigger all kinds of illnesses in miners. And apparently there's hordes of retired miners in Niger suffering from all kinds of cancers. And this is the grim reality of a neo-colonial system. It has been preserved like that because partly the French cooed out the first guy who was going to do something about it. And secondly, the other part of this matrix of neo-colonial control is what I've mentioned before. It's the CFA franc, which enables the French to control, or has enabled them until now perhaps, to control the currencies of all these different countries, control their monetary policy. A monetary policy which is now, of course, because the CFA franc is linked to the euro, when the French franc was replaced by the euro, their interest rates are all set by Brussels. And yet they have to deposit a ton of their gold reserves inside the Bank of France. So this is the textbook example of neo-colonialism, of what the French have done here. By the way, before any offended French colonialists start saying, oh, what about the British? The British have done very similar things. The British are a little bit more subtle, but no less brutal. So bear that in mind. And we will be coming in future episodes to British neo-colonialism, how its differences and its similarities. So the other thing I wanted to mention at this stage was, of course, the entirely fake, complete bullshit war on terror that has been apparently waged in places like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso for much of the last decade by French imperialism and, of course, American imperialism. Now, if you can remember back to, it must be 12 years ago now, in the early part of 2011, when suddenly Mali was all over the news. I don't know if you would remember that, but I remember because I was working in the civil service at the time in a government department that will remain nameless due to me having signed the Official Secrets Act. The talk of the moment in this, of the liberal press, was we have to help Mali. And, bear in mind when an imperialist country says we have to help somewhere, that country should be shutting up shop pretty soon and sticking guns out of all the windows. But there was this talk of course, of a jihadist movement that was incredibly violent, that was, all the usual buzzwords being used, targeting women, we have to do something, etc. And the heroic French were going to deploy their forces in Mali to take on the jihadists. And of course, a lot of these jihadists had been, if not unleashed, then aided in the extreme by the fact that the Gaddafi government had been destroyed by imperialism, which was using jihadists as foot soldiers. And of course, then these groups got hold of the arsenals of the old Libyan army and used them to make war in Mali, Niger, and other places. So imperialism caused the problem, and now they want to claim that they are going to solve it. So what happened when the imperialists sent their armies into Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger? Well, what happened was that the jihadist attacks got worse, and the imperialists appeared to be unable or unwilling to actually stop any of this. So there are some scholarly articles on this that I will dig out and post in the future, but the number of soldiers of the Malian and Nigerian armies who were killed by jihadist attacks, or at least attacks credited to the jihadists, spiked after the deployment of French troops. And in fact, the amount of violence that was inflicted upon these countries got progressively worse over the last decade, until eventually, of course, the Burkinabes and the Malians pulled the plug on the French. And there are accounts that I've read of when the French tried to move their military columns around Mali, even before the Malian military junta came to power. Malian civilians were actually blocking the French and trying to block their military convoys, leading to confrontations and civilian deaths, because they associated the presence of the French with an upsurge in jihadist violence. And of course, again, the masses know more than anybody credits them with. They can put two and two together and realize that whatever game the imperialists are playing here, it's certainly not about eliminating the jihadists, because there's more of them now than ever. And the imperialists, of course, were never serious about eliminating them. They were serious about using a situation that they had created with their elimination of the Libyan state to pressure these governments into accepting something that would be, of course, wholly detrimental to their economy and society, which is, of course, the reinsertion of French forces into their old colonies. And this is true in Mali, in Niger, and Burkina Faso. The so-called war on terror was nothing of the kind. Same way, the so-called war on drugs, that the United States justified deploying extensive numbers of so-called special forces teams to Bolivia and to Colombia, was nothing to do with fighting the drug cartels, which the US intelligence services had been in business with for decades, and there's no bigger drug dealer in the world than the US government. True 50 years ago, true now. And it was never about, of course, taking them on. It was about, of course, inserting forces into these countries in order that you could apply pressure to the governments in these countries whenever you wanted to, and justify any amount of military intervention on the grounds of fighting the cartels. It's the same trick that the US imperialists are trying to pull now with regard to Mexico. It's why you have all these drooling moron senators who've been given a new talking point, going out and saying, well, we have to fight the Mexican cartels. I mean, you've seen Pete Buttigieg say it. You've seen Lindsey Graham say it. You see, like, the various right-wing talking heads, including people like Douglas McGregor, say it. Well, why are we in Ukraine when we need to get control of Mexico? This is clearly something that they're considering doing. The point is that it's the same practice in play. Imperialism creates a problem, i.e. drug addiction and drug supply and drug cartels, and then offers a solution, which is, well, we'll come in there and essentially use a military occupation force to exert greater control over your government and your country. Or they insist that you have to start a war on drugs, which is what a previous Mexican president did. I believe was Calderon over 10 years ago. And of course, he started trying to take military action against drug cartels that are supplied with military-grade equipment by corrupt officials within the Mexican police and army. And, of course, chaos ensued. So, of course, Lopez Obrador is now confronted with this situation, is trying to deal with it, but the American imperialists are trying to manipulate the situation to be to be able to, in essence, control AMLO's government. So the same process is going on in places like Mali and Niger. And as I said, the masses know and understand this very well, which is why that they were revolting against French patrols entering their territory before the officer corps in the Malian and Nigerian armies got to the point where they started to revolt. Because again, it is absolutely clear what is going on. When a supposedly powerful military force, which is what the French still nominally at least have, and what the Americans have, says we're going to come in here and fight jihadism, and what do? They sit there making it worse. That's not an accident. It's not that they're not capable of eliminating large numbers of people. They can certainly do that. It's that they weren't interested in doing that. The presence of the jihadists, their long-term presence in any country, enables a greater usage of and deployment of American, British, French, whoever, military forces into that country on a permanent basis on the grounds that you're fighting jihadism. I mean, I think they probably hope to do the same with climate change. Elizabeth Warren would get her Green Army, and then you could deploy it to countries like, I don't know, Mexico or Venezuela, and it would probably be supported by Naomi Klein. A Green Army deployed to Venezuela to stop petropopulism. It sounds like I'm joking, but it's it's close. It's close. I mean, bear in mind the imperialists have been trying to essentially cripple the energy systems of places like South Africa by destroying their coal industry and their coal-burning power plants, whilst offering them absolutely no alternative that's worth anything. All of these things that come up are things that are like terrorism, narcotics, the climate change narrative. These are all things that are created by imperialism, one way or another, and are deployed by imperialism in order to justify further exertions of domination over colonized countries and countries suffering from neocolonialism. And of course, the many aspects of the left in the West now end up supporting all of this. Now, there is a particularly egregious and awful article in New Left Review about the events in Niger, which I will spend a whole episode on in the future, because it's particularly, it's peak British Trotskyism in so many ways. But I'll return to that in a future episode because it's particularly good. I'm going to pause now to say hello to those who've come into the chat. So, Zuleika says she was kidding about the Barbie review. Well, thank God for that. Good evening to Sneaks. Good evening to Rob A. And good evening to Alexandros. Good evening to my comrade Ben. Good evening to my comrade Beju. And hello to Harry. HM down in Brighton. Sorry about Eddie Izzard. Hello to comrade Naylor and Dingo Ate Me Baby. And okay, so Ben's got a couple of questions in here. I think these are the questions for the Q&A. So I will make a note of those as we go along and make sure that those get added to the list. If you've got questions for the Sunday Q&A, be sure to add them as we go through tonight. Add them in the chat and I'll get them copied over to the list. Okay. So, and hello to Tomsk from Akarunya. Sneak says, according to high up in the DIA, every major dealer led to the CIA. Well, yeah. I mean, the CIA, it has been, I think, pretty comprehensively proved at this stage, were, along with various other government agencies, were the major players in the establishment of the heroin trade going to the United States. And they were doing this out of the enormous opium growing production facilities that they had in place in, I believe it was Thailand and South Vietnam and other places in what was used to be called the Golden Triangle. And this was part of the reason why they got in a turf war, basically, with Nixon and ended up trying to coup out Nixon. Another story for another day. It's not to say that Nixon was any good. He was as dirty as it gets, but they got involved in a bureaucratic turf war with him, partly related to their drug smuggling operations, which are very well established by this stage that this is what they were up to in Southeast Asia. They were using drug trafficking to fund operations that were so horrendous that even the US Congress might have hesitated before approving them. So the CIA was behind a huge drug dealing operation in Vietnam. It is, again, comprehensively established, and the CIA has admitted to it, that the reporting of Gary Webb was correct in when he uncovered the fact that they were sending plane loads of cocaine into, I believe it was LA in the early 1980s, smuggled out by the Contras, and they were selling this cocaine to LA street gangs who were turning it into crack, and this was the start of what became known as the crack wave in the United States. And again, Gary Webb's reporting was attacked, and people were screaming that the government would never do this. Then he mysteriously killed himself by shooting himself twice in the back of the head. Make of that what you will. But Webb's reporting was proved to be correct. The CIA were doing that, and they were using the money that they got through drug dealing to fund the operations of the Contras, which largely involved murdering peasants in Nicaragua who dared to attend Sandinista literacy programs. This is the kind of people that the CIA employs. Not tough fighters, but cowards who kill civilians and do drug dealing to fund themselves. So again, like you can track like the progress here and see that if the CIA was a major player in the drug dealing business 50 years ago and 40 years ago, and they have a very long list of connections with drug barons in Central and Southern America, well, I think it's pretty clear that those connections don't just go away. They didn't just turn over a new leaf. Well, and also look at Afghanistan. Why is it that so many of these opium poppy growing fields came back after 2001? Well, the people that the CIA and, of course, the American government itself were in bed with, those formerly described as the Northern Alliance, were directly engaged in the business of drug dealing, selling vast amounts of opium derived from poppies to the West. So what happened with that? Do we think that the CIA and other intelligence agencies in the United States might be involved in trafficking a load of this stuff into America itself? Given that they've done it twice before and that they were directly in bed with these characters who were growing the opium, growing the poppies, I think it's a fairly good guess that they were involved with them again. Again, great way of making money. And given that the CIA's budget is essentially almost completely secret, and they would probably still love to supplement it somehow, I think it's a pretty good guess that they were involved in this opium trafficking, and that the opioid wave of addictions and destruction of so many lives in the United States can be traced back again, just as with the crack wave, just as with the first heroin wave 40 and 50 years ago, back to the US government itself. And again, all the noise about heroin, about drug dealers, tougher sentences for drug dealers, that kind of shit, the stuff that Biden was engaged in the 90s, stuff that Reagan used to talk about in the 80s, it's all bullshit. Now, they're throwing a bunch of lumpenized elements in prison, but essentially they are the drug dealers themselves. It's a fairly common practice. You know, you create a problem, then you proclaim that the solution domestically is locking a load of people up, and then the actual reality is that you continue to run the operation and make tons of money off it. You cannot find a level of cynicism and brutality to which the imperialist governments will not sink. There's no level of depravity that they will not engage in. So, okay, so let's look at other comments here. Hello to Philbin from Rhode Island. Hello to Irish Partisan, our man in Minsk. Very interesting interview given yesterday by Lukashenko, talking of Belarus, which I would encourage comrades to watch. You can find it on YouTube. It's all in Russian, of course. It's an interview with a Ukrainian journalist who I don't think works in Ukraine anymore. Certainly she wouldn't be welcome with this kind of message. But if you are able to use YouTube's auto-translate, it's not particularly great. It does, but you can get the gist of what he's saying. He says a lot of interesting things, which I'll be covering in a separate video. Worth checking out nonetheless. Good evening to Burke. Yes, Ben says those are for the Q&A. Sneak says, mysterious that the CIA ran the drug trade that was the basis for jailing a third of the black population in the wake of the civil rights movement. Well, as I believe it was John Ehrlichman, Nixon's old advisor, who confessed just before his death that, yeah, the war on drugs was completely about eliminating dangerous political tendencies in the United States. So, yeah, take it from the horse's ass, you know. This is exactly what they wanted to do. It wasn't about a sudden and sincere concern for the safety of inner city communities. It was about finding a situation which they had created and utilizing it for their own benefit. So, other things to mention with regard to moving back to the question of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, etc. With regard to the Burkinabe events, as I've said before, the President Traore has, of course, appointed a veteran of the Sankara years to run the government administration. They've brought back like the mass mobilizations of people into the defense of the country. And the question then goes back to, well, how is this playing out in terms of a revolutionary process? And of course, every process is a little bit different. But where you've got this mobilization of the masses now, I would make the argument that the engagement of the masses in a political struggle is, of course, what the imperialists and their stooges have been seeking to push back now for forever. They understand very well, or at least some of them do. The intelligence men, the military men, the smarter end of the politicians, in places like France, Britain, certainly the United States, they have read and absorbed and understood the work of particularly Mao and Stalin as well, probably, on the role of the masses in the revolution. They know very well that once the masses have been mobilized by particularly a communist party, but any leader in the colonized world, be it some kind of socialist government, some kind of revolutionary nationalist, once the masses have been mobilized to defend the revolution and are mobilized in an ongoing basis, it becomes incredibly difficult for the imperialists to knock that government out. For instance, I would encourage you to go to the podcast I did recently with Dermot Hudson of the Korea Friendship Association. And he's talking about people's career on there. And what he says on there about the relationship between the Workers' Party of Korea and the Korean masses is crucial in understanding why the DPRK has survived. Because without that ongoing engagement with the masses by the WPK, and without the fact that the masses are engaged directly in the management of the state and the economy, then you don't understand, or you cannot understand, why People's Korea has survived as long as it has, and why it continues to actually go from strength to strength. It is because the leaders of the WPK, not just the Kim family, though of course they play important roles as figureheads of it, but all the leaders understand about the proper application of the mass line with regard to the survival of the revolution. And it is only by tapping into the energy and creativity of the masses in a disciplined way and bringing this into both the party and the state consistently that you avoid opportunism and revisionism, but also that you keep the revolution going forwards, because that is what the continued engagement of the masses with the party provides. It provides a ongoing connection, an ongoing mobilization, and it is through that ongoing mobilization that you drive out the counter-revolutionary tendencies. And this is proved if you do a comparison between, of course, the fate of the Soviet Union and the CPSU and what happens with in the DPRK. Because the concern of Khrushchev and his clique, and I would say it's a concern which I don't know whether it was paramount above all others. There were other considerations that the revisionists had, but certainly it was one of their big objectives was to push the masses out of the direct role they were playing in the management of the economy and the state, and of course in the party. Now, they weren't wholly successful, but they did damage the role of the masses in the party and the state enough so that the bureaucratic clique around Khrushchev and then Brezhnev and then Gorbachev could slowly morph and merge with a nascent underground capitalist class, and that the masses, even though they were able to block certain elements of the revisionist agenda, weren't in a position to successfully push the revisionists out and purge them from the party. So that when the revisionists went just straight over into becoming outright counter-revolutionaries, though the masses were wholly opposed to this and wanted and were willing to fight, there was no leadership that had emerged there because their role had been, role of the masses had been damaged sufficiently by the sabotage campaign of the revisionists over many, many years. Compare that to People's Korea, compare that to Cuba, where, again, the role of the masses has been constant throughout. Compare it even to places like the revolutionary process in Nicaragua, where, again, the survival of the Sandinista revolution there during the attempted counter-revolution of 2018 that the US was so directly involved in, was down to the mobilization of the Nicaraguan masses in defense of the revolution. And the fact that the masses in Nicaragua were actually prepared to go a lot further in terms of chasing out the counter-revolutionaries than the Nicaraguan government was. And that might perhaps have been a smart move on Ortega's part, but we can cover that in more depth in the future. But also in Venezuela, where it's the mass mobilization of the proletariat, particularly in Caracas, but also the other major urban centers, that of course saved Chavez in 2002. But it also saves the revolution repeatedly in all the attempts at counter-revolution that were waged by Obama and then by Trump and now by Biden. It is the fact that the masses are continually organizing inside their own democratic bodies, inside the working class areas of the country, and of course have their own armed organizations inside Venezuela, which is of course the advice that Castro gave to Chavez many, many years ago, which is that have the masses organized and mobilized with arms in their hands to defend the revolution against the reactionaries. And again, that is why Venezuela survived, or it's a huge part of the reason why. It's why, of course, Nicaragua survives. So to go back to the question of why is it the case that this is such an important move in Niger and Burkina Faso, that the masses are getting armed and active? It's because the leaders there and the masses themselves have looked across at these other examples, particularly in South America and Central America, and can see what happens when they are directly involved in this revolutionary process and are mobilized and armed and engaged and ready to fight. Well, not only does it actually severely restrict the maneuverings of the undercover counter-revolutionaries and reactionaries, it also really puts off and puts the scare on the imperialists and their puppets, because it's relatively easy to take out a military regime with no roots in the masses at all. It's much, much harder to destroy one which actually has the masses mobilized and ready to fight. Now, of course, they succeeded in murdering Sankara in 1987 because that betrayal did come from within. But of course, they weren't wholly successful, because the example of Sankara survived and then 30 odd years later returned. But again, people are learning from the examples of successful revolutionary processes elsewhere in the world. And so to see that happening in Africa right now, this is hugely significant. And it is, of course, something which does have roots in the country, because even as far back as the 1970s and 80s, there were socialist experiments in the African nations, in places like Benin, where there is talk now, but I need to establish exactly what is going on there, that there might be the re-emergence of some kind of socialist movement with the capability of taking power again. And this wave of revolutionary processes that has begun is something which is potentially catching hold across the area, which is one of the reasons why ECOWAS and the African Union can't agree on anything. The African Union, of course, has states within it that would be opposed on principle to armed intervention, but also it's got a lot of states in it that are worried about what would go on if the African states, particularly the comprador regimes, were seen to be acting purely in the interests of French and American imperialism. It might mobilize the proletariat and peasantry in those countries to dispose of the likes of Bola Tinubu in Nigeria. And of course, the suicidal move from the imperialist point of view, or the suicidal move for the imperialists, would be to pressure the Nigerians and their puppet Tinubu to act against Niger in such a way that actually angers the Nigerian masses to the point where they rise up against him. But again, this is what starts getting unlocked at this time, when you see, to link this to the widening processes, when it is visible that imperialism is weakening and that its hold over its previously compliant regimes is slipping, and when it's being defeated by Russia in Ukraine, and when the American imperialists are unwilling to actually fight the Russians directly. And so they start to look more and more weak. and people start to believe correctly that imperialism is the paper tiger that Mao described it as so many years ago. Okay, so we've got more questions coming in. Peter says, do you think that covert evils, operations of Washington intelligence agencies, breeds endemic paranoia in them? They trust no one, even one another, and spy on everyone, including each other. Is this? I think what I'll do is, with all these questions, I'll stick them into the Q&A, if that's all right with everybody asking them. Okay. So I'm gonna copy these across into the Q&A then. You got Daniel from Maryland. Hello from Washington D.C. Ben says the first pillar is the ideological development of the masses, creativity and self-reliance of the masses, powers development, but without ideology it is fragile and is ever threatened by revisionism. Very true, and this is the other point I wanted to make. The crucial goal of the Khrushchevite revisionists, or one of the crucial goals, was to make sure that the masses were pushed out of the revolutionary process, or that the revolutionary process was ended. And again, this is something that the revisionists in the PRC were desperate to do as well, but weren't wholly successful. And it was because the Cultural Revolution left a big mark on the Chinese party in terms of a more powerful proletarian and revolutionary wing that is still there and has actually been reasserting itself in recent years, so that the Dengists weren't able to go as far as they wanted to. And I would argue that the GPCR, Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, though it ultimately ended, or it came to a close in failure, it did actually lay the groundwork upon which the success and the survival of the Chinese party and the People's Republic of China still stand to this day. It had a much more positive impact than everyone's prepared to admit, in other words. Right, so to look at another thing I wanted to mention before closing off tonight was, of course, the outcomes from the Russia-Africa summit. Now, of course, this is so a lot of the characters we've been discussing, like Traoré from Burkina Faso and the Malians, were there, as were a lot of others who are very much not communists, like Yoweri Museveni from Uganda. But there were several points that came out of it which I think are worth emphasizing, because they emphasize the fact that the Russians now, despite perhaps the instincts of many of them, have ended up playing a role that in Africa aids anti-colonial work and anti-colonial struggles. So several things that came out of the final memorandum of the Russia-Africa summit are worth just dwelling upon for a moment. So the fact that they established that the Russians are going to provide more anti-terrorist cooperation to the African nations will be something that disturbs the imperialists for all the reasons that we've gone through already with regard to who's actually benefiting from the jihadist operations in places like West Africa and Nigeria, of course. And in the case of the Central African Republic, I mean, I need to do more reading on this. It seems that the jihadist operations there are being damaged by the presence of the Russians via the Wagner organization. It's not been completely successful yet. It'll be a long struggle, but they're having more success than the French ever did, mainly because they actually do want to bring success there. I would say, though, also to remember that a purely military solution to these problems, which come from, in terms of the jihadist organizations, they scoop up a lot of lumpenized characters in these countries that come out of desperate poverty and are scooped up by the jihadist organizations and marshaled into a fighting force. The true way out, the true way to undercut these characters so that they can't come back, is, of course, a revolutionary process. The building of a new country, the proper industrialization of the country, the revolution in the agriculture of the country, the direct involvement of the masses in the management of the society. And that's the way you actually make sure that these ultra-reactionary movements are killed off for good. Can't neglect the military side of it, but again, you look at the historic examples of success and you can see why jihadist organizations and other forms of ultra-reactionary religious types hate the idea of socialism and communism so much, because that is the most effective way of making sure that such reactionary movements can't come back again, because you take away the social base upon which they are built, which is backward feudalist modes of productions that still survive, and also the accompanying immiserated peasantry or lumpenized elements that do exist thanks to sort of failed capitalism in these countries. So interesting that that's in there. They're also talking about, of course, more integration with the Eurasian Economic Union of the African nations, and the increased trade and settlement of trade between Russia and the African nations in local currencies. Again, more de-dollarization and more de-euroization as well, which is another thing that we don't mention, but perhaps we should dwell on in future episodes. The fact that de-dollarization is, of course, incredibly important because of the role that the dollar plays in securing the American imperium. But also, if they're going to be trading in local currencies, it means less trade for the euro as well, and more damage to that, which can only be welcome. And of course, agricultural cooperation. That's another thing that was highlighted in the memorandum, because this is something that Traoré of Burkina Faso said, and other African leaders have said, is that they want to get to a point where, much like Nicaragua and, of course, Venezuela, they are able to be self-sufficient on food. They've now correctly all identified the fact that one of the reasons why the imperialists like the idea of Africa as somewhere which is perpetually on the verge of starvation is, of course, it enables them to exercise control. I mean, one of the sick things about the charity industrial complex, one of the many sick things about it, is, of course, that it all grows out of this absurd racialist lie about the idea being that the African nations just can't grow enough food, can't govern their own affairs, etc. They need the benevolent missionaries of Oxfam and the Red Cross to go and feed them. And of course, as Kwame Nkrumah points out in his work, Neocolonialism, the agricultural capacity, or at least the agricultural potential, is there in a lot of these African nations to grow enough food to satisfy the demands of a growing population. But the reason why they are unable to is because first of all, anybody who tried to actually develop food sovereignty for these nations was a leader who was killed very quickly or cooed out by the compradors or by the imperialist power directly. And also, even when some of these characters wanted to develop agricultural capacity in these countries, they don't have any capital to do so. And so, back in the day, you could have got assistance from the Soviet Union, but in the late 80s through the 90s, like if you wanted to develop any agricultural capacity to revolutionize your agriculture, you needed to go and get capital from World Bank or IMF, and they weren't going to lend to anybody who actually wanted to promote programs that would guarantee food sovereignty for any of these countries, because that's not what the IMF and the World Bank are about. They're about increasing dependency or sustaining dependency, which this is something that Thomas Sankara and other African revolutionaries have understood, that they had to break free of the aid trap and the debt trap. And again, if you think back, if you're raised in an imperialist country, as obviously I have been, and I think it's fair to say that, comment if otherwise, but most of us either contributing to or watching this stream right now have been, you grow up with the racialist myth perpetuated by the bourgeois press in imperialist countries, that where the problem is that these African nations just can't feed themselves. Again, as I said, the myth is, they can't govern themselves. And this is, again, something that the bourgeois press in Britain are repeating about Niger. The idea is, one of the reasons why they're so poor is that there's just too many of them, that they've had too many children. Again, Malthusianism en masse. This is what the bourgeoisie always reverts back to. This is how they view their own population. This is how they view the domestic working class. They're certainly going to view the working class and peasantry in the African nations this way. And the sick thing about the way we're indoctrinated to think about these countries is that they're backward, barbaric, etc., can't feed themselves because they can't develop any economic potential. And then you actually discover the truth, which is that anybody who tries to do any of these things is cooed out and or killed. And the British, the Americans, and the the French, the Germans, the Italians, all the imperialist countries work as hard as they possibly can to prevent the development of any truly sovereign system that can feed itself. A country that can feed itself is much less likely to be able to be controlled externally. A country that has minimal or no external debt can't be easily pressured. So that's how they want these countries. They want them to be up to their eyeballs in debt, unable to provide the population with food, unable to economically develop, so that they can remain backward, they can remain just sources of raw resource extraction. That's how they want them to be. So when you get like some fucking BBC guy pretending to care and weeping about starvation in a certain country, well, that's how the imperialists wanted that country to be. If the country in question was actually progressing towards being independent of the imperialist financial or agricultural or trade systems, then they'd be screaming for military intervention. And so the development by the Russian Federation with the African nations of this agreement on promoting agricultural production in these areas, that is a event that we should welcome if indeed it comes to pass that they are able to actually develop this. And of course, the technology to reclaim desert areas, to actually make the difficult to farm areas actually into productive land, technology is out there to do that. The nations that are very poor, though, just need assistance in actually doing so. Now they've got potential partners in the Chinese and the Russians, then that is a positive step forward for revolutionary processes in a lot of these countries. And of course, they've been talking about and another interesting thing, which is, of course, they're working with the African nations on increasing coal production, which again is the literal opposite of what the imperialist countries have been doing. The imperialist countries have been using bribes, threats, and coercion to get the African nations to stop producing and using coal. Now, why is that? Is that out of a sincere concern for for so-called climate change? No, it's to weaken them. They're trying to essentially destroy domestic coal production in South Africa and destroy their usage of coal in order to weaken their energy production, weaken their industrial capacity, and to make South Africa into a more backward country that can be more easily exploited and have more wealth stripped out of it. That's what they want. They don't want a South Africa that's well developed, has a well developed energy grid, has a more developed industrial system, has a more efficient agricultural system. They want a backward country that can more easily be pushed around and that can more easily be coerced into signing very negative trade deals with the West. And all of this is now greenwashed, and with the added assistance of the Western left, of course, who cheer all this shit on and actually say that the imperialist nations aren't going far enough with this agenda. So this is the way you have to look at these things and understand it. Greenwashing, pious lectures about human rights, pious lectures about sexual freedoms. All of this is just, shall we say, a modern-day version of the missionary work that went on in the 1880s and 1890s. It's new forms of proselytization to better propagandize people and also coerce governments into doing what you want. So, the other interesting things that are going on, they're talking about increased educational cooperation. Of course, the Russians have renamed and reopened again the Patrice Lumumba University. Very interesting development there. And something that, of course, Yeltsin got rid of in the 90s. And they're also developing media projects together to basically make sure that the Russian message gets across even further to African nations, which, of course, it's being enthusiastically received in at the moment because the African masses, or at least large numbers of them, are identifying the Russian struggle against NATO as something that they can relate to. Now, the other thing to mention, of course, is the recent comments by Putin, where he said that the Russians would cooperate militarily with all countries that were looking to assert their sovereignty. Now, of course, Putin sometimes speaks directly, sometimes speaks a little more vaguely, but you can't escape the importance of that statement that was made last week when you consider it's made in the middle of the Niger crisis, where, of course, the Russians, even though they have couched their words very carefully and have denied that they had anything to do with the coup and the emergence of this new potentially revolutionary military government, they, of course, were opposed to external military intervention and have said now, through the statement of Putin, that they will assist those who are looking to assert their sovereignty. And, of course, whether I'm pretty sure that Putin did fully understand the meaning of his words, he would have chosen them very carefully. That is basically firing a starting pistol for anybody who wants to overthrow a neo-colonial regime, overthrow local compradors. So, again, this is Putin, the man who for 20 years, or for, well, maybe more accurately about 10, sought partnership with the West, has ended up being pushed into a situation where he's now promising assistance to those who actually challenge the sources of profitability of the remaining imperial powers. Again, a very interesting development, one that we should all be aware of. So, I'll now pause to see how many more questions we got. Beiju says, who has the greater revolutionary potential, lumpen or liberal? Well, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I would say when you look at this, lumpen is a class. Lumpen proletariat is a class. Liberal, I mean, it generally is associated with the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie. I mean, in terms of both, the lumpen can be dragged along behind or wrapped or brought into a revolutionary movement. But it's a revolutionary movement that the proletariat, and in some countries' cases, the peasantry will be in the lead of. The lumpenized elements get dragged along, and of course their existence gets revolutionized as a result of that revolutionary process. So there is potential there, but it's neither of those classes, either lumpen or petty bourgeoisie, is going to be in the lead. It has to be, the revolutionary process has to be driven forward by the proletariat, and again, depending upon the makeup of the country, the peasantry as well. The way, there's a great way that the great Chairman Mao puts it, which I will seek to just find in this authentic 1960s little red book that I have to hand, because there's a great quote, I think right at the beginning actually, on the role of the Communist Party, which it's important to understand. So, let me just take a look at that. Quote reads as follows. If there is to be revolution, there must be a revolutionary party. Without a revolutionary party, without a party built on the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary theory and in the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary style, it is impossible to lead the working class and the broad masses of the people in defeating imperialism and its running dogs. So this is a important thing to bear in mind when you're talking about the what will need to be an alliance of oppressed classes in places like Mali or Niger, which is that the next phase should or must involve the development of communist parties. And I know that there are more communist parties emerging in a lot of these places. And shout out to the communist rappers, as Beiju says, as these revolutionary processes go onward. So the emergence of a Marxist-Leninist party in all of these countries is going to happen, I'm sure, and that they will play crucial roles in the organization of the revolutionary processes in those countries, because I think we're going through a great period of disturbance amongst the global communist movement, such as it is. You're seeing a lot of useless organizations get exposed at the moment, and I'll be talking more about this with relation to the Greek Communist Party and their false position on the Russia-NATO war in a future episode, because the World Anti-Imperialist Platform has put out a very interesting statement, which I think it's worth us probably spending an hour going through in the future. But the movement is being shaken up. The communist parties all over the world are being shaken up, and new ones will come into existence. The Kenyan comrades are a very good example of that, because they went through a long period of sorting themselves out and forming a new party that grew out of the remnants of old parties. And you're going to see that happening in all kinds of places now. You're seeing it even in the imperialist countries, like the old organizations are being shaken up to the point where they'll either be reborn or be destroyed. And this is a good process, because what will happen is more and more people will discover the immortal teachings of the science of Marxist-Leninism and be able to compare those teachings to the practices in the communist parties, especially in Europe and the imperialist countries, and find them to be wanting. And so a lot of these parties will be cast away and torn asunder, and new ones and new formations will emerge as a result. And this is going to happen as part of the process of class struggle and the process of the disintegration of the deeply reactionary regimes which have ruled inside the imperialist countries and elsewhere for many, many years now. So this is a very interesting period that we're going through now, a period where, again, communist parties will be reborn as part of the class struggle. And we should all be ready for that process. So, could Africa exemplify a wave of revolutionary resolve that could fatally weaken the Western imperial dictatorship? Another question for Sunday, I believe, but I will just I'll conclude tonight's stream by just saying this. The most interesting factor in this current revolutionary wave that's starting in West Africa is, of course, the re-emergence of the masses as a potential driving force of the revolution. That's what everybody, in terms of the reactionaries, be they revisionists or social democrats or liberals or open reactionaries, what all of them have sought to destroy over the last really 60 years is what Mao was talking about when it comes to the role of the masses. And this is, I'll be discussing this in much greater depth tomorrow on the program I'm going to be doing on Mao's text on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. What the reactionaries do realize is that once you have the masses mobilized, but you have them mobilized in a disciplined way and through the correct application of the mass line, and you have them fueling these movements which a communist party is at the center of, then that is a huge threat to imperialism and to capitalism domestically in the imperialist countries as well. It's why they worked so hard to destroy the legacies of Stalin and Mao and others who have, of course, been practitioners of Marxist-Leninism and who have been developers of revolutionary strategy. The reason why they still work so hard to diminish these great leaders' reputations to this day is because they are afraid of their true legacies. It's why you've got to dig through 80,000 layers of garbage to actually be able to study properly the history of the USSR in the revolutionary period and China in the revolutionary period. Okay, so I'll put your question, Peter, in the Sunday Q&A. Ben says combined food, energy, sovereignty is the real threat. Very true. Daniel from Maryland says many Black Panthers argue that under certain settler colonial conditions, the lumpen play or can play a more solidly revolutionary role than lumpen elsewhere in imperial core countries. You know what, Daniel? I'm going to put that in the Sunday Q&A as well, because there's a lot to say about that. Yeah, a lot to say about it. So if you don't object, I'm going to answer that on Sunday, and we can discuss it further then. Right. I am going to call it a day for now, or call it an evening, in fact. So a big thank you to everybody who's joined the stream tonight. Comrade Jason from the Class Consciousness Project, Zuleika, President Jesus, Rob, Sneaks, Alexandros, Ben, Beju, Harry, Naylor, Dingo Ate Me Baby, Peter, Tomsk, Philbin, Irish Partisan, Burke, and Daniel from Maryland, Beju, Lord Charfield, and anybody else who I've forgotten to mention. So, hope you've got a lot out of this. It's always interesting for me to do these. I hope you found it interesting as well. But until tomorrow, when we're back with a look at the Mao text on the correct handling of contradictions among the people, I will bid you good night and wish you a happy weekend.